China is making it harder for its citizens. For Muslims to travel to the Mecca or anywhere else. More the travel of Chinese. Of Muslims reflect the extraordinary measures that China is taking to monitor its citizens and prevent them from performing Hajj, as well as the equally ingenious ways in which the worshippers circumvent their circuitous journey of Chinese Muslims reflects the extraordinary means that China are taking to keep tabs on its citizens and prevent them from Hajj, as well as the equally ingenious ways in which the worshippers circumvent them. Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. They left their village in the blink of an eye, dropping prayer caps and headphones at the airport, ditching prayer caps and head shawls in favor of casual sports, and silently praying that they would not be prevented from leaving China. The group of 6 travelers were Chinese Muslims intending to make the Hajj once in a lifetime. Muslims must make pilgrimage to which this year took place in late June, early July. When we get back to China, we may have our passports cut or confiscate our passports. But we will face with whatever we have to do when we get back, said one of the 3 male travelers who have been in contact with this group of 6 pilgrims since May, when they set out from their village in northwest China toward the holy city of Saudi Arabia. Their winding path reflects the extraordinary measures that China is taking to monitor its citizens and prevent them from performing the Hajj, as well as the equally ingenious ways in which believers circumvent them. The NPR does not use their names or their village to protect them from official scrutiny. Since returning to China, the Chinese authorities have severely restricted the religions practiced, especially Christianity and Islam in the region. Since 2017, years ago, XIN people have been detained or arrested. At least hundreds of thousands of Uyghurs of the historically Muslim ethnic minority in other parts of northwestern China. Provincial authorities are demolishing mosques or forcibly removing their Arabic-style domes, closing Islamic schools and monitor religious leaders this year when, in the wake, the coronavirus pandemic has intensified travel around the world. Chinese authorities have closed off almost all routes overseas to Muslim believers for fear that they might radicalize overseas or stir up religious fervor after returning to China. According to interviews with a dozen Chinese Muslims, public security officials have been sent to the country's airports to screen outbound travelers heading to Islamic countries, and were tasked to call and force pilgrims who are already abroad to turn around and return home. Those who have performed the Hajj privately, outside of state-sanctioned tours, are detained or arrested upon. When you return to China, China wants to control you even when you're outside the country, said one of the pilgrims getting a passport. The first problem facing those wishing to perform the Hajj is getting travel. China has stopped issuing new ports during the coronavirus pandemic, but in practice, restrictions remain particularly severe for the estimated 20-30 million Muslims, which is about 1.5-2% of the country's total population in the northwestern Chinese province, Qinghai, where the pilgrims live. Authorities have stopped issuing new passports altogether. To residents who are Uyghur or Hui, other predominantly Muslim ethnic group. According to 7 Muslims living there, these Restrictions on passport issuance. Echo controls long in place. In the western Chinese region, Xinjiang, where passports for ethnic Uyghurs began to be confiscated in 2016, a year before, authorities began a massive campaign of detentions aimed mainly against Uyghur communities. Restrictions on passport issuance in Qinghai started after a former party secretary of Urumqi, the capital of the Sen region, was transferred to a position, a high-ranking party official in Qinghai this year. In Qinghai province, those who received passports were required to sign official letters promising that they will not perform Hajj while traveling abroad. To perform Hajj, according to 3 Chinese Muslims, each of whom signed such letters, a 4th Chinese Muslim said that they also had to provide a letter of enrollment letter and bank statements. A bank statement indicating that they were traveling abroad to get an education and not to Hajj. The 6 pilgrims with whom the NDP has been in contact were lucky enough. They were able to obtain travel documents 3 years earlier by applying through passport office a few hundred miles from Qinghai province. Crackdown on private Hajj tours, passports in hand, but the group still needed someone to organize their trip and, crucially, could get the Hajj visas that Saudi Arabia requires of all pilgrims. However, in the run-up to this year's pilgrimage, Chinese authorities began arresting of private tour leaders. Of those arrested was a tour leader named Mei, who also writes online about both scripture and Chinese religious politics under pseudonym. TFN trained as an Islamic theologian, Ma has for the past 2 decades, he has led private groups, Hajj organizations for hundreds of Chinese Muslims a year. In 2019, state security officials have launched an investigation into him in his home province of Minsk in connection with his activities in organizing Hajj. In April of this year, he was arrested in the northwestern Chinese city of Lang on charges of running illegal business. Islam is protected by our country's constitution. Hajj is the most important of the 5 pillars of Islam, Morocco wrote in a letter of appeal that has been made available to us. The official policy of our country is to administer religion in accordance with the law, but in practice, many citizens face restrictions on legitimate religious activities, including Hajj. China organizes state-approved Mecca tours. But for the pilgrims contacted by NPR, this is not an option. According to pilgrims are on a waiting list for the limited number of Hajj seats that Saudi Arabia is allocating to Muslims in China has been in place for at least 5 years. In addition, China prohibits its public sector employees Hajj regardless of their age, otherwise the employees risk losing their pensions and other government benefits. Not giving up hope, the pilgrims decided to make the journey on their own, keeping in touch online with dozens of acquaintances and other Hajj travelers. To gauge the likelihood of success, was especially nervous because they had 3 elderly travelers from before last year. Saudi Arabia required that all pilgrims to be fully immunized against COVID-19, and quite a few have been 65 years out of pandemic-related restrictions this year. This year, those age limits have been lifted. However, according to 4 people familiar with the Hajj policy of the state-run Islamic Association of China, which organizes the approved delegations for the Hajj in the country, selects only pilgrims under the age of 65, the Association and the governments. The Islamic Association and the government's Department of Religious Affairs did not respond to NPR's request for comment when we received information that several other pilgrims had left the country. Decided to make the Hajj together using with our own funds, said one of the pilgrims. The group of 6 left Shanghai. The next day, the long and winding journey, the group did not fly directly to Saudi Arabia because the travelers told them that this would give away to Chinese security officials that they were Hajj pilgrims instead. The group first booked tickets to the southern city of Guangzhou, a major international transit hub. Once they landed, police officers from their hometown called one of them on their cell phone and asked why they were leaving Qinghai province and whether they were planning to perform Hajj. The group replied to the police that they were traveling for work, then disconnected their cell phones, and the group's panic decided to fly to central China, passing through 2 more domestic airports before flying to Malaysia, a Muslim country in Southeast Asia. Each time they went through security at the airport, they said they were trying to maintain silence from the other pilgrims. They heard that security officials, Qinghai security officers, have been stationed at airports all over China to pick up their regional accents. 2 other Chinese Muslims traveled this year told that their police officers specifically assigned to Chinese airports, when the officers checked their identification cards, which listed them, were listed as Hui, an ethnic group which is historically Muslim, the travelers were taken aside for questioning about whether they were going to the Hajj. To hide their faith, the group took off the chadai and put on new sportswear bought the day before. I felt almost naked, said one of the older women. A traveler since childhood, one of the pilgrimage belonging to a folk verse. She said she was going on vacation and was missed. The group went straight to one of the largest mosques in Kuala. There, surrounded by reminders of Islamic piety, the tension of the past week had taken its toll. Carpets crumbling beneath their feet. Burst into tears from Malaysia as the group flew out to Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, but they knew that they weren't safe there either, according to 3 Chinese Muslims. Even after leaving China, the Hajj travelers continue to receive threatening phone calls from local police officers demanding their immediate return. A group of pilgrims from Shanghai were dismayed to learn upon landing that 4 travelers from their hometown were forced to return back to China from Hell's Eagle after Chinese police officers threatened to punish their relatives. This multi-armed surveillance reflects the harassment and threats on the internet, which, according to representatives of the Uyghur diaspora, regularly receive from Chinese security authorities, even after fleeing China. While in Saudi Arabia, a group of 6 pilgrims agreed to remove the batteries from their Chinese smartphones for fear that security personnel in China could track their movements on the devices, or that they would receive even more threatening phone calls. They were worried that they would have to find a private driver willing to take them to the Mecca city in Saudi Arabia, where the Prophet Muhammad delivered his last sermon, and which is the pinnacle of the annual spiritual journey because they didn't have official visas and passes required to pass through checkpoints. In June, they successfully completed the 2-week Hajj by walking around the Kaaba, the sacred, the black-colored cubic building in Mecca. Now they faced the daunting the prospect of returning home where they awaits the punitive aftermath. We must have faith that we will overcome all the obstacles we face, said one of the pilgrims. We take one step forward and then meet the next.